looking for ways to eliminate the attribution altogether. I also liked his discussion of why it doesn't bother him when people say, I could care less. Pedants will tell you that you're supposed to say you couldn't care less. If you could care less, that means you care a little. And Mr. Dreyer and I both agree that, get over it. You know what they're saying. They're being sarcastic, and there's little point in nitpicking people's sarcasm. Okay, here's one area in which we do disagree. He's okay with semicolons, pointing out that Shirley Jackson used them all the time. Well, I love Jackson's work. The Haunting of Hill House is one of my favorite novels, but semicolons in your fiction and popular fiction, no. I think it makes it look like a dissertation and something people don't want to read. You want your book to be inviting, to bring people in. To be fair, I remember that Justin Cronin's novel, The Passage, had them all over the place. He was a former academic. May still be, I don't know, but he wrote academic work before he wrote this popular fiction, and there were like 6 semicolons a page. I thought this book will never catch on, and I was completely wrong. It not only caught on, I think there's a television adaptation on the air right now. So either I'm wrong, or it's possible to overcome any failing if your story is strong enough. The bottom line here, I think, for Red Sneaker writers is that, of course, you need to know the rules of grammar, but you have to also remember that your primary purpose as a writer is not to please your grade school English teacher, but to write a compelling story, one that draws people in, that makes the reader be glued to the page and keep turning pages long into the night. I've just gone over the galleys for my forthcoming novel, which, by the way, is called The Last Chance Lawyer. And I was reminded of some of the things that my English teachers of the past might not approve of, but I will do them sparingly to improve a book. For instance, the occasional, not overdone, but occasional use of fragments to increase the pacing, the sense of urgency. I have pretty much given in dialogue to the technically incorrect use of the subjunctive. That means saying, if I was, in dialogue, because that's how people say it rather than if I were. And I've also completely gone on board with the use of they or their, the possessive their, even in the singular case, because we do not have a gender-neutral possessive pronoun in English. So most grammarians are now saying it's okay to use their, T-H-E-I-R, not only in plural but in singular case as a way of avoiding saying he or she all the time. I suspect that in less than a generation, this will catch on and become standard practice. Always remember that you don't want to do anything that will draw readers out of the story, but your main focus should be telling a good story, keeping people immersed in the story, and in dialogue, of course, that includes making the dialogue sound like something real people would actually say. My interview for this podcast is with Shawn Coyne, the creator of The Story Grid. As you're about to hear, Shawn was an editor for New York publishing houses for many years, and over the course of doing all that editorial work, he started to develop theories about what a good book, novel, or sometimes even nonfiction needed to contain, what authors often left out, and what were the elements that led to success. He's since written books about this, and with his co-writer Stephen Pressfield, he's written other books like The War of Art, and they two together now publish Black Irish books. Let's hear what Shawn has to say. Shawn, thanks for being on the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Bill.
If you could offer one piece of advice to an aspiring writer, what would it be?
Well, the one thing I always say is to think about what book have you read that if you could go back in time and put your name on as if you had written it, what would that book be? And once you sort of, for example, say you're a Hemingway fan and you say to yourself, geez, if I could just have my name on The Old Man and the Sea, then that would be a wonderful thing. And then what you do is you step back and you say, well, what is The Old Man and the Sea? What is its genre? How could I possibly be inspired by that one specific work in a way that I could create my own Old Man in the Sea? And then you take it from there. And I'm a great believer in understanding the specific genre in which you are working. And then that genre will, unearth so many different tools for you to be able to construct a story that people will really be, interested in based upon their love of the genre too. So always start with the thing that you love. Use that as your guiding principle, the thing that you aspire to. And that is a wonderful way of directing your energies toward something that you value and care about.
That makes a lot of sense. I think in many cases, my starting place has been, I really love this. How can I capture that kind of mood or sentiment or feeling, but still write a different book?
Of course, yeah.
Takes you different places. That's a great answer. You have been all over the publishing business, 25-year plus veteran, including being an editor where you've edited.
I was an editor. Yeah, I was an editor at Dell Publishing, at St. Martin's Press, and Doubleday over a period of about 15 years.
Is that when you started? Of course, if you're editing books, you have to start thinking about what works and what doesn't.
Right.
Probably what mistakes you're seeing over and over again, or problems with manuscripts. Is that sort of the genesis of the story grid?
Yeah, that's exactly what it was. It was when I started in the industry, it was around 1992. The way you became an editor at a major publishing house was through an apprenticeship with a mentor editor. And the thought was that you would learn the craft from that specific editor, depending upon who you worked for. And to some degree, that was very helpful. But what I discovered is that those editors really didn't have any time to teach me their craft. So it was impendent upon me to actually come up with my own craft and to figure it out myself. So one of the jobs as assistant to an editor is to, be the first reader on the manuscripts. And I wanted to do a good job. So I wanted to figure out, how does one determine whether a story works or not? And so that led me back to the classics of Aristotle and Plato and all of those big thinkers about story, the three-act structure, Norman Friedman's theories about genre, Robert McKee's work at story, E.M. Forster's work, John Gardner's work, all those novels that we all read that are on the novel, or Edith Wharton on writing, or Stephen King on writing. So after reading all of those and sort of compressing the age-old knowledge, I came up with a system that helped me determine whether or not a book was working, whether or not a specific audience would be attracted to it. If we put it into the marketplace, how would it perform, based upon the general principles that I've sort of outlined in my book, The Story Grid, and at the Story Grid website. So it's been sort of a 25-year process of condensing and a lot of story theory and putting it into practical use for the writer. And it all began as figuring out what book is going to work in such a way that I'll be able to rise in a corporation and a hierarchy so that I could make a decent living. So that's generally where it came from.
Well, I would think the advantage of having this grid or this, plan, outline, thoughts about it was that you can go beyond just saying, it didn't work for me. And
yes, exactly.
Get more specific about what the problem is.
That's exactly it, Bill. And the thing that I think you can relate to as a writer with so many wonderful novels in his history and more to come is, I think, probably the most frustrating thing for a writer is to spend 12 to 15 months on a work, deliver it, and have an editor say things like, the middle was a little weak, the protagonist was a little soft, and I'm not sure that your ending really came through all that well. And to take that information and somehow use it in such a way that will identify what part exactly, what specific point, what scene, what character is the problem. So I wanted to take all of that sort of mystical language and boil it down to something like, in scene 36, your crisis is not clear, and we're not really sure why that character made that active choice. Can you go back and dissect that and rework that scene in such a way that it's very clear that the value has shifted and it has turned, and that there's actually a movement of change from the beginning of the scene to the end? And then if you start speaking that way to intelligent writers, they go, oh, I understand exactly what you're talking about. Yes, what scene was that again? And then they can go do their work, bring it back, and you can have a conversation in a practical way to fix problems so that the manuscript can work.
Right, that makes it fixable, as opposed to just thinking, oh gosh, my book stinks. And
yes, it takes away the personal self, torture that we all do. When we create something, it's a life that has its own, and we're very protective of it. And when somebody criticizes it, we naturally start to feel, oh boy, this is terrible. Our child is ugly and there's nothing we can do about it. Instead of saying, well, I can fix this. What are the problems? The problem, you are not the problem as the writer. The problems are the problems.
Now, we call it the story grid, or you do, and I've been using the term, which makes it sound like it's a big chart on the wall or something, but you've written an entire book here explaining these principles, right?
Yes, it actually is an entire grid. The idea is, I'm a believer in the two hemispheres of your brain. You have a very mystical, big picture side, which is the right side of your brain, and the left side of your brain is more the analytical side. So what the story grid represents is the combination of those two elements. The big picture thinking that outlines the 3-act structure, the beginning, middle, and end of your story, and does it in a graphic representation. So I've created story grids for Pride and Prejudice, for Silence of the Lambs, to demonstrate how globally a story can move from one place to another and affect us emotionally through the use of an infographic. Now, the way to create this story grid infographic is to create 2 additional documents that inform you. One is called the Global Foolscap page, which is one piece of paper which represents sort of your global macro 30,000-foot view of your story.
Right.
So it's sort of, if you were forced to discuss what your next novel was going to be, and somebody said, you got 3 minutes, that's what that page you would use to describe it. And then once you have that one sort of global roadmap, then after you've created your manuscript, the story grid spreadsheet is the second document. And the spreadsheet goes scene by scene. It goes through the continuity. It goes through the event in each scene, the polarity shift of the value at stake in each individual scene. And then when you put those two, that peanut butter and that chocolate together, you create the Reese's Peanut Butter Cup that is the story grid itself, which is a really wonderful reference. It's a masterwork reference sheet. And earlier when I spoke of, write that novel that you admire the most, if you dissect and use the tools of story grid, you could create a document that you can refer to be able to work from. So when you get stuck and you say to yourself, I don't know how to complicate this middle, you can go to your story grid of, The Old Man in the Sea and see how Hemingway did it. Right. And then maybe use that as inspiration for your problem. So it's all sort of a very organic process that has very neurological, underpinnings. And it brings together, the analytical side of the writer as well as the very fantastical, inspirational, mystical side of the writer. And it's a very effective tool, and I've used it for 25 years with a number of different people, and I think it's really, really practical.
Well, I love the way you talk about the interaction between left brain, right brain, which I've heard people say, well, it's creativity, it's creative writing, it's right brain. And I keep trying to tell people, no, it's both. You just use different parts at different